Alright, so today we're going to talk about cell theory and types of cells. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the history. So, important to the discovery of the cells was the invention of the microscope in 1590. And then about 100 years later, so in 1665, Robert Hooke, Hooke, publishes the first drawing of cells. And what he did is he looked at cork cells. Now, if you recall, cork actually comes from trees. So what he was really looking at were the first pictures, the first looking at of plant cells. Okay, so and you can see a little drawing there. Then in 1674, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, okay, that's a kind of a funny way to spell it, so on a test just be able to recognize it. He found living organisms in pond water. And you guys will do a pond water lab as well, but not until we get to ecology. Then about 200 years later, in 1838, Matthias Schleiden concluded that all plants and animals must be made of cells. And the reason this came about is because everywhere they looked at all the plants and all the animals they saw, they took samples under the microscope and saw that they too were made of cells. In 1839, Theodor Schwann concluded that animals are made of cells. Okay, so they talked about plants. Plants are really easy to see. And then Schwann came along and said, well, what about animals? And so he specifically looked at the animal samples. In 1855, Rudolf Virchow concludes that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. And this was because when they were looking at the cells, they could see cells dividing to become more numerous, but you had to start with a single cell. Okay, so that's how he came to that conclusion. So for the test, just be able to match some of those scientists. All right, so what is cell theory then? The first part of cell theory is that all living things are composed of cells. The second component of cell theory is that cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things, meaning they are the smallest thing that still functions like a living thing, but if you were to break it down, right, so cells are technically made of atoms, but if you take out those atoms and those elements, they don't function as a living thing. So remember our living things lab where they have to respond to their environment, maintain homeostasis, all of those things they cannot do when they're smaller than a cell. So that's why it's, the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. So the smallest unit that we talk about. And the third thing is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. And again, this was because whenever we looked at cells, we could see them dividing, but you always had to have one cell to start with. And now we know actually how to make that first cell through fertilization. Okay. So what are cells? Cells, again, are the building blocks of all living things. They're surrounded by a cell or plasma membrane. I think your book calls it a plasma membrane, but these two terms are the same. And then within the cell, it has things called organelles. Now, organelles you could think of them as tiny organs. So that's where this word comes from. So organ, meaning organ, and then L, meaning small. So they name these because they were like little organs in the cell. And let's see, what else? Structure, how something is put together and what it's made of, and then function is the purpose of something or its job. So in class we are going to take notes on that chart, and you're going to have to put down the structure, what it looks like, and what it's made out of, and then the function, what does it do. There are two major groups of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells is a picture right there on the side, and that is bacteria. So bacteria are prokaryotic cells. Pro actually means early or before. And the root word kary, K-A-R-Y, actually means cell. So these were the early or before real cells. And then eukaryotic cells, and the EU means new, kary still means cell, and these are the new cells. So prokaryotic cells, talking about bacteria, are simple, single-celled organisms, meaning they're organisms that are only one cell. Their DNA is not enclosed in a nucleus. So their DNA, if you look over to the picture of that bacteria cell, is just kind of scattered throughout the cell. So they don't have a nucleus, and they also don't have many of the organelles. They do, however, have ribosomes, okay? So when you think about bacteria, think that they only have ribosomes and they have their DNA scattered throughout the nucleus. They are actually much smaller too, okay? So think of bacteria. On your hands you have millions and millions of bacteria, but you cannot see them. All right, then we have eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are more complex. Now we have a nucleus that has the DNA, and we have other organelles in there, so you can look at that picture, and they each have a specialized function. We can further divide the category of eukaryotic cells into plant cells and animal cells, and there's going to be unique features of both. Examples of these, protists, so they can also be single-celled, or they can also be multicellular. So before, when we looked at pond water in the lecture, earlier in the lecture, what he saw some protists, and protists were only one cell, but they were a functioning organism. They were able to eat, they were able to move around, some of them even did photosynthesis. So here we have the two differences. We have our bacteria, which is smaller, so notice that the weird little letter and the M stands for a micron unit. So bacteria are much smaller, and they only have cytoplasm, they have their DNA but no nucleus, and they have ribosomes. Whereas the eukaryotic cells has many other organelles that the prokaryotic cell does not have. So write this flowchart down so that you remember. Cells can be grouped according to prokaryotic cells, those are the early cells, or eukaryotic cells, the new cells. Prokaryotic cells, we're talking about bacteria. They don't have a nucleus, and they are single-celled. Eukaryotic cells can be single-celled, but can also be multi-celled, and those are our plant and animal and protist cells. So they will have the little organelles and a nucleus, which has the DNA. Now, you may ask, what about viruses? Well, viruses we don't characterize as living, and the reason we don't is because they actually need a host to survive. They cannot survive on their own. They don't maintain homeostasis. They're kind of a foreign being. So we define viruses by particles that are made of nucleic acid, so they're made of proteins, and they reproduce by infecting living things. A virus cannot reproduce without infecting a living thing. So we say that they are not living. They're also not made of cells. So if you look at that picture, it looks like kind of a weird robot-looking thing, and that's what they look like. So they're not a cell at all. All right, well that's our little intro to cell theory and cell types. Make sure you know the 3 parts of cell theory. You'll be tested on that. The difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And then we'll talk more about eukaryotic cells in class as we fill out the organelle chart. All right, see you tomorrow.